there can be things that you would potentially want to challenge. So the way that those factors are applied to your project might depend on sort of some quite kind of detailed technical factors. So we have seen projects go from having the hundreds of millions of pounds worth of liability to having zero liability based on challenging some of those factors. So I think probably that's the thing to be aware of, that actually there's quite a lot of detail that sits behind those calculations.
Hello and welcome to the Connectology podcast. Here, Road Knight Taylor's influential team of elite connection specialists and their expert guests help you to better understand distribution and transmission network connections and how to acquire them faster, for less cost and at lower risk.
Hello, I'm Pete Aston, a connectologist at Road Knight Taylor, and I'm joined by my colleague Catherine Cleary to talk about the complex but incredibly important subject of cancellation charge liabilities and securities. So, cancellation charges and securities are a huge topic, and this podcast is really just a brief introduction, but fear not, as we will be giving a webinar on this subject in a few weeks' time, so keep a lookout for more information about where to sign up. Now, there aren't very many days that go by when Catherine and I don't talk about cancellation charges in one way or another. So this podcast is really just a snapshot of the geeky existence we at Road Knight Taylor have, although we love it. So Catherine, I'm going to sort of come to you. Could you just give us a brief overview of what cancellation charges and securities are?
Yeah, sure. So for anyone who's got a transmission connection or potentially a distribution connection where you've been through a project progression process where some work's been identified, you'll probably have seen an MM statement or a securities statement, which is National Grid asking you to stump up a bit of cash to underwrite your liability. Effectively, that's because Grid operate in quite a different way to DNOs, whereby they are doing an awful lot of reinforcement work, transmission infrastructure investment, and they are funding that themselves, so they don't pass the capital cost on to developers up front. So they need a bit of skin in the game from developers or connecting customers, and that is done via the cancellation charge of methodology. So essentially, everyone who is connecting contributes a bit of a bond, a cash security or a performance bond to National Grid in the event of them cancelling. And then if they were to cancel that scheme, effectively National Grid would reconcile how much money they owe them for the fact that now no one's going to connect, no one's going to be paying TNUoS charges. Okay,
thank you, Catherine, for that. That's great. So could you give us a sort of a brief overview as well of how how securities, I should say, are paid? Because there's a variety of different ways that developers have, aren't there, to actually stump up those securities.
Yes, exactly. So your liability is the total cancellation charge you could be liable for if your project cancelled at any time. And obviously that changes over time. So as you get closer to your connection date, that liability increases. You're asked to secure a proportion of that liability. Again, that changes in time. So when you're early days, when you're what we call pre-trigger, you are asked to secure 100% of that. And then it steps down as the project kind of progresses and as the certainty increases that the project will connect. The options you've got are essentially cash, which is what unfortunately most people end up having to do. So that is you putting a depositing amount in a sort of holding account with National Grid. They're not allowed to touch it, by the way. It just sits there in a bank account. You can provide a parent company guarantee. So that's essentially if, perhaps the project is an SPV, but it's being developed by, some very well-funded players who have the necessary credit rating. If you actually meet the credit rating yourself, then National Grid have a requirement in terms of like a Moody's standard credit rating. Then you don't have to provide any kind of cash security. You can just say, trust us, we're good for it. Unfortunately, the only people who are likely to be able to meet that parent company guarantee or the credit rating themselves are sort of very, very large scale kind of multinational players or financial institutions.
Okay, thank you for that, Catherine. So I think just coming back on the need for these cancellation charges, I guess some developers might think it just seems like a way for National Grid to make money from unfortunate developers who can't progress their projects. Is this just a way for National Grid to make money, or is this more of a cautionary stick for developers so that they don't progress with schemes unless they really think that they can?
Yeah, I mean, I actually really strongly sort of believe in that process, because I think otherwise what you would see at transmission in particular is an awful lot of people kind of joining the queue who didn't necessarily have the kind of financial backing or perhaps the confidence in their projects to proceed. So I think it's a really good kind of check and balance to make sure that there is a bit of, like I say, a bit of skin in the game, that people aren't just able to kind of sign up to offers which then potentially sterilise the network because of that kind of capacity being held. So I think it can act really quite well. I think what we sometimes see, and probably the things we talk about most, Pete, are when it's obviously quite a kind of formulaic process. It's relatively complicated to actually get to the bottom line of how much you have to secure. But sometimes that kind of formula, because of particular network scenarios, it can end up sort of having the wrong implications. Occasionally we see projects with basically no security, when actually, that's maybe the wrong signal. And sometimes we see projects which have unviable levels of cache security required really, really early on, just because of the way the numbers work. And I think that's kind of, that is becoming really quite a big problem here.
Yeah, thanks for that, Catherine. And it seems to me like there's occasionally some sort of unfortunate consequences from cancellation charges and securities, in as much as cancelling a scheme is not something that a developer wants to do, because they're going to then pick up the cancellation charges for pulling out, and we then potentially see developers just staying in the contracted queue for perhaps longer than they might have done otherwise. And could you just sort of talk us through how maybe the tech amnesty is trying that's going on at the moment is going to sort of try and help with a little bit of that?
Yeah. So absolutely. So tech amnesty, in a nutshell, is giving people the option to cancel without paying their cancellation charges. So for projects that were quite far progressed but have issues, that's a pretty sort of golden opportunity. I guess though, Pete, one of the things is that not very many projects reach that stage. What's perhaps more common is to see projects who are kind of, with their connection dates quite far out, so they're perhaps at quite a low level of security at the moment. If things are looking uncertain, simply mod app to kind of push those connection dates back, because that in turn will push their kind of security cache kind of profile back as well. So I suppose, I kind of agree with you. It does perhaps in a very short-term sense send a signal to say, maybe I shouldn't cancel this now, because if I cancel it, I'm definitely going to have to pay, whatever it is, 50 grand worth of cancellation charges. Whereas I could just mod app it and sort of push that decision down the road without increasing my liability. 50 grand is probably actually a very, very bad example. There's probably quite a lot of projects with an awful lot more than 50 grand's worth of cancellation.
Yeah, I think so. Thanks, Catherine. So I think it's probably worth us sort of highlighting a few of the terms that are used within the sort of cancellation charge and securities methodology. So you've got terms like wider liability and attributable liabilities. So would you sort of mind quickly outlining the difference between the two and how that works out by National Grid, how they're calculated, roughly speaking?
Yeah, absolutely. So wider liabilities are the kind of easy ones, I think, that most people have sort of got their head around. That is just a zonal charge. So it's £1 per kilowatt charge, and the country is broken up into all of the different ETIS zones. We call it the zones you would see in the National Grid maps. And each one of those zones is given a £1 per megawatt charge. You'll see places where there are lots of reinforcement work going on will have much higher charges than places where there's not very much work going on. So those are forecast in advance, so they're relatively predictable. Occasionally we have sort of big jumps and surprises, but those charges, those wider cancellation charges, they're effectively sort of capturing the background reinforcement work that's going on to improve kind of wider boundary flow capability in the network. They only apply in the 4 years before you connect. So if you've got a connection date out in the 2030s, you won't be seeing any of those charges yet. When you get to your trigger date, that's when those charges kick in. By contrast, you've got attributable cancellation charges, which are based on the attributable works for your project. These are much more project specific. So you'll see some projects which have 0 attributable works, no attributable cancellation charges, therefore, and we'll see projects which perhaps because they're connecting into a specific substation where there's huge amounts of work going on, and a lot of that work therefore is attributable to that project. I think the record so far is I've seen a project with £350 million worth of attributable liabilities. There's far more variation here. And those are works which are specifically happening anywhere between where the project is connecting and the nearest main interconnected transmission system node, so MITS node. So that's really site specific. And this is a really good point in terms of whether or not the system's working well at the moment, because I think when this methodology was introduced, the anticipation was that attributable works to a project, which apply from as soon as you sign your offer, they are based on how National Grid actually have to spend the money. So you have a couple of options. You can either just sort of go with that actual profile, so based on whenever the TO is doing the work, that is when the liability will become incurred, or there is an option to sort of fix, so to kind of hedge your bets and fix based on some rules. Those rules cap that liability pre-trigger, and then post-trigger they're sort of a linear profile. Traditionally, most people didn't fix. The penalty if you fix, it sounds good to sort of, fix your liability, but the penalty is if you then cancel, you just lose all of that. There's no kind of reconciliation going on. So most people go with actual, and the issue here is that it's based on when National Grid's doing the work, even if National Grid's maybe not doing the work for your connection. So we've seen quite a lot of offers come out recently going into substations which are perhaps being rebuilt, having some of the major 400 kV upgrade projects, and those works are happening now. So even if someone's connection date is perhaps 8 years away, then the level of attributable liability they're seeing on the day they have to accept the offer is very, very high, because the works are happening now. So that actual profile is very high. And I think that's something that developers really need to look at very carefully, potentially even before they make an application, because some of that stuff you could predict. The reason for the webinar, Pete, I think probably came out of a conversation we had, didn't we, about making sure that people sort of understand some of the detailed mechanics about how the works which are attributable to you become a cancellation charge, because there are various sort of factors. So you've got things like a SIF factor and a LAF factor. It's loads of acronyms, but it's important to know how they work, because there can be things that you would potentially want to challenge. So the way that those factors are applied to your project might depend on sort of some quite kind of detailed technical factors. So we have seen projects, go from having the hundreds of millions of pounds worth of liability to having zero liability based on challenging some of those factors. So I think probably that's the thing to be aware of, that actually there's quite a lot of detail that sits behind those calculations, and it is worth reviewing and challenging before you either accept an offer which you think is going to be low liability or decline an offer which you think is high liability.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Connectology podcast. If you found it helpful, please share it with any of your colleagues or connections you think may be interested. And please do subscribe at Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your content. You can find out more about our services at roadnighttaylor.co.uk, link in the description, where you can also sign up to our free Connectology newsletter for more news and thought leadership in network connections. If, during this podcast, you found yourself wondering what it would be like to have a Road Knight Taylor connectologist in your life, please do email laura@roadnighttaylor.co.uk to find out how their game-changing skills and insight can change the game for you too.